I am writing this in fragments because that is how the memory returns, broken, electrical, never whole. In 1952, I was a radar technician with the Royal Air Force, stationed at a restricted defense zone that officially did not exist. Our orders were simple: track aircraft, log anomalies, report nothing unusual unless commanded. But one night, the scopes began to behave as if something was watching us back. Signals without speed, objects without heat, and then the visual confirmation, silent shapes hovering where nothing should hover. We were told it was weather. We were told to forget. But radar does not imagine. And men who watched the sky that night did not all survive with their minds intact. This account was never meant to be read. Welcome to Combat Lore Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. Some military bases are classified. Others are erased so completely that even remembering them feels like trespassing. That I was 24 years old when the RAF sent me north along a coastal road that narrowed the farther we drove, the landscape flattening into scrub grass and wire fences that stretched toward a gray, unwelcoming sea. My orders were thin as cigarette paper. Report to a radar installation. No postal address. No unit insignia. No questions. The driver dropped me at a steel gate that rose out of the fog like a scar, guarded by 2 armed airmen who checked my papers without speaking a word. Behind them, the base sat low and hunched against the wind. Concrete buildings half swallowed by mist, aerial masts stabbing into the sky like skeletal fingers. Even before I stepped through the gate, I felt the silence of the place. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that presses against your ears, daring you to break it. I was an RAF radar operator by trade, trained during the final years of the war and retained after. When the enemy changed from visible bombers to invisible threats we were told might come at any hour. The Cold War was still new enough that no one spoke its name aloud, but we all felt it. At this station, that tension was distilled into routine. Watch the sky, log everything, speak little, ask nothing. The commanding officer, a squadron leader with eyes permanently rimmed red from sleeplessness, welcomed me with a briefing that lasted less than 5 minutes. This installation does not exist. Your families do not know where you are. Officially, you are on extended technical assignment. Unofficially, you are here to observe. That word, observe, hung heavier than any threat. We were not defenders. We were watchers. The station itself seemed designed to be forgotten. No markings, no flags, just rows of low buildings surrounded by double fencing and floodlights that burned even during the day, casting pale halos into the fog. Beyond the perimeter lay an old coastal exclusion zone dating back to the war, land evacuated during fears of invasion and never properly reclaimed. Locals avoided it. Fishermen steered clear of the shoreline. The sea itself looked wrong somehow, darker than it should have been, as if it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. At night, the fog rolled in thick and low, swallowing sound. You could shout your lungs out and hear nothing come back. I was assigned to the night shift within my first week. Radar Hut B, a cramped room humming with electrical life, smelling of warm metal, ozone, and stale tea. The scope glowed green in the darkness, its slow rotating line sweeping the invisible sky over and over again. Each sweep was comfortingly familiar. Aircraft signatures were patterns I knew as well as my own handwriting. Speed, altitude, direction, order in a chaotic sky. But the men who worked that hut before me were not the joking, half-drunk veterans I'd known on other postings. They were quiet, watchful. One of them, an older corporal named Hargreaves, had the habit of rubbing his temples whenever the foghorn sounded from the coast, as if the noise physically hurt him. During my first nights, nothing happened. Or perhaps more accurately, nothing obvious happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the station itself was listening. Every creak of the building sounded deliberate. Every crackle of radio static felt too close, like breathing. We were told not to tune civilian frequencies, not to discuss our readings outside designated channels, not to speculate. Speculation, the squadron leader said, was how fear took root. But fear was already there, woven into the routine. You could see it in the way men paused before entering the radar hut, in the way conversations died when an officer passed by. I learned bits and pieces in whispers. The base had been constructed hastily during the war, then repurposed and expanded after 1947. Why, no one would say. Supplies arrived irregularly, always at night. Once, I asked Hargreaves what exactly we were watching for. He stared at the scope for a long moment before answering, "Anything that doesn't want to be seen." There was no humor in his voice. The folklore crept in the way it always does in isolated places. Someone mentioned old stories from the coast. Lights seen hovering offshore during blackouts, long before radar ever existed. Fishermen who swore the sky had eyes. Wartime pilots who reported silent companions pacing their aircraft, dismissed officially as exhaustion or reflection. I laughed it off when I heard it, but the laughter sounded wrong in that room. Too loud, too human. The radar continued its sweep. Indifferent to my unease. By my third week, the station felt less like a posting and more like a burial. Days blurred together in gray repetition. Nights stretched endlessly, broken only by the sweep of the scope and the distant crash of waves against forbidden shore. We were buried men watching a buried sky. And buried things, I was beginning to understand, do not like being watched. That understanding came slowly, like pressure building behind the eyes. Small inconsistencies, a blip that appeared for a fraction of a second, then vanished before I could log it. A faint distortion in the sweep, like static shaped into intention. Each time I followed procedure, logged it as interference, equipment anomaly, weather artifact. That was what we were trained to do. That was how you survived careers and courts-martial alike. But at night, lying in my bunk with the wind rattling the barracks walls, I replayed those moments over and over, and they never felt accidental. There was a sense among us, unspoken but shared, that the station had been placed here not to guard Britain from attack, but to observe something already present. Something tied to the coast, to the fog, to the stretches of land no one reclaimed after the bombs stopped falling. We were not the first watchers, just the latest. The night the sky finally changed, I reported for duty as usual, unaware that routine was about to become memory. I adjusted the scope, logged the time, and listened to the familiar hum settle into my bones. Outside, the fog thickened until the floodlights looked like pale moons trapped in cotton. Inside, the radar sweep turned, steady and patient. If the place itself felt buried, the night the sky changed felt like it was digging us up. Radar does not dream, but that night it began to hesitate, as if deciding whether it should tell us the truth that I came on shift just before midnight, relieving Hargreaves with the usual exchange of nods and clipped remarks that passed for conversation at the station. The hut was warm with machinery heat, the air faintly metallic, the green glow of the scope painting our faces in sickly light. Outside, the fog pressed close to the windows, turning the world beyond the glass into nothing at all. I logged the time, checked calibration, ran the standard test sweep. Everything appeared nominal. No scheduled flights, no friendly patrols. The sky, according to our charts, should have been empty. That was when the first echo appeared. It was so brief I almost dismissed it outright. A faint return near the edge of the sweep, not sharp enough to be a conventional aircraft signature, not diffuse enough to be weather. It flickered once, then vanished before the sweep came around again. I leaned closer to the screen, heart ticking a little faster, and told myself what every radar man tells himself in moments like that. Interference, coastal moisture, faulty reflection off the sea. I marked nothing and let the sweep continue. When it returned, it did so closer. This time the echo held long enough for me to mark its bearing. Still no altitude profile that made sense. No speed trail. It wasn't moving forward so much as existing in place, as if hovering was not an action but a natural state. My fingers hovered over the logbook, uncertain. Training told me to record anything anomalous. Experience told me to be careful. The wrong entry could summon officers who asked questions no one wanted to answer, and I marked it as an intermittent contact and watched. The echo vanished again, then reappeared on the next sweep, stronger. Not larger exactly, but more confident, the return sharper, the outline more deliberate. The scope's soft hum seemed louder suddenly, the rotation slower, though I knew it was not. I checked the gain, adjusted sensitivity, recalibrated the range. The contact persisted through every adjustment, Indifferent to my efforts to explain it away, I called for the supervisor. A flight lieutenant named Morris entered the hut with the stiff posture of a man who had not truly slept in years. He stood behind me, arms folded, eyes locked on the scope. I pointed out the contact, explaining my adjustments, my uncertainty. He did not interrupt. When the echo blinked out again, I felt a brief, irrational relief, quickly extinguished when it returned, now closer still. "Log it," he said quietly. "Manually." I hesitated. "Sir, should I?" "No radio reports." His tone was flat, final. "Not yet." He watched in silence as I wrote the entry by hand, describing what I could without committing to what I could not explain. Intermittent radar return. Unknown origin. No transponder response. Parent stationary behavior. Each word felt inadequate, like trying to sketch a shadow. Morris nodded once, then left without another word, leaving me alone with the screen and the growing sense that something had shifted. The echoes continued. They did not behave like aircraft. Planes cut paths across the sky, their returns tracing arcs and lines you could follow with confidence. These contacts did nothing of the sort. They appeared, disappeared, then returned nearer the station, as if distance were a suggestion rather than a rule. There was no acceleration curve, no change in altitude that fit known physics. The radar was showing me presence without movement, existence without transit. I wiped sweat from my palms onto my trousers, aware that my breathing had grown shallow. At one point, a second echo appeared, then a third, not scattered, not random, but arranged, spaced evenly as if by design. The sweep passed over them one by one, each return pulsing faintly, then more strongly, as though responding to being seen. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, irrationally expecting someone to be standing there, watching the screen with me from the darkness behind. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. Not dead, still powered, still humming, but empty, as if the air itself had withdrawn from it. I attempted a routine check-in with perimeter watch. No response. Procedure dictated escalation, but Morris's earlier instruction echoed in my head. No radio reports. I logged again, my handwriting tightening, the letters growing smaller and more cramped as the night wore on. Time began to behave strangely. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, yet the minutes between sweeps felt elastic, stretching and compressing without warning. Each time the echoes returned, they did so with greater clarity, as if the radar were tuning itself to them rather than the other way around. I adjusted nothing now, afraid that any interference on my part might invite attention I did not want. The most unsettling realization came slowly, like cold seeping through fabric. The echoes were not random in their appearance. They were synchronized with the sweep itself, emerging just ahead of the rotating line, as if anticipating it. As if they knew where and when they would be seen. Radar, I had been taught, was a passive observer. It sent out signals, received what bounced back. But this felt reciprocal, conversational. Around 2 in the morning, Morris returned, this time accompanied by the squadron leader. Neither man spoke as they studied the screen. The echoes held steady, 3 distinct contacts hovering within restricted airspace, violating every regulation without triggering any alarm beyond our own tightening nerves. The squadron leader exhaled slowly through his nose. "Continue manual logging," he said. "All shifts. No deviation." "Sir?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "What are they?" He looked at me then. Really looked, his eyes reflecting the green glow like deep water. "They are returns," he said. "Nothing more." Then he turned and left, the door sealing behind him with a final metallic click. The echoes lingered until just before dawn. As the first hint of gray crept into the fog outside, they faded one by one, not retreating so much as dissolving, as if the sky itself had decided to forget them. When the sweep finally showed nothing but empty air and distant sea clutter, I felt no relief. Only a hollow certainty that what we had witnessed was provisional. Incomplete. A debrief was held later that morning. Brief by name, brutal by implication. Equipment malfunction. Atmospheric conditions. Known phenomena. We signed statements agreeing to those conclusions. The radar tapes were removed, replaced with blanks. My handwritten logs were confiscated, returned hours later with entire sections blacked out. No one spoke of the echoes openly, but the station felt changed. Tighter, more alert, as if it too were waiting. That night, as I took my place once more before the glowing screen, I understood that denial was now part of the procedure. We told ourselves it was faulty equipment, because the alternative required admitting that something had entered our sky without permission, without propulsion, without explanation. The sweep began again, steady and patient, and I watched it with the dread of a man who knows the question has already been asked, and is only waiting for an answer. We told ourselves it was faulty equipment, until the echoes began to move with intent. The first confirmation did not come from radar, but from a man standing in the cold with a rifle, staring straight up into a sky that had begun to stare back. The call reached the radar hut just after midnight, sharp and clipped, cutting through the low electrical hum like a blade. Perimeter watch, southern fence line. The sentry's voice was controlled but strained in the way men sound when discipline is the only thing keeping fear from spilling out. He reported lights above the exclusion zone. Not flares, not aircraft, lights that were low, silent, and stationary. Morris was beside me almost instantly, his jaw tightening as the message repeated over the line. Procedure demanded verification. Denial demanded distance. After a brief exchange with command, Morris nodded once toward the door. "You're coming," he said, not because I outranked anyone, but because what I'd seen on the screen had already tied me to whatever waited outside. The night hit me like a living thing when we stepped beyond the hut. The fog had thinned just enough to reveal the sky, though it did not make it any kinder. Floodlights cast pale cones across wet concrete and chain-link fencing, their glow swallowed only meters out. The sea wind carried a sharp, mineral tang that burned in the nostrils. As we walked toward the perimeter, I became aware of a sensation I had never felt before, a pressure behind the eyes, a faint vibration under the skin, as though the air itself were humming at a frequency too low to hear but too strong to ignore. The sentry stood rigid at his post, knuckles white around his rifle. He did not salute. He did not speak. He simply raised one trembling hand and pointed upward that I followed his gesture and felt my breath leave me in a slow, involuntary release. Above the restricted zone, just beyond the fence and the warning signs bleached pale by years of weather, shapes hovered against the stars. They were not lights in the conventional sense, not glowing or burning. They were absences, darker patches against the night sky, each one outlined faintly by a soft halo that bent starlight around it. 3 of them, maybe 4, perfectly still. No engine noise, no exhaust, no motion of any kind. They did not drift with the wind. They did not wobble or correct themselves. They simply were. The longer I stared, the more wrong they became. My mind reached desperately for comparisons. Balloons, experimental aircraft, tricks of light, but none would stay. The shapes were too deliberate, too composed. They reminded me of something organic, like massive eyes half-lidded in sleep, suspended above us. The pressure in the air intensified, settling on my chest until breathing felt like work. Somewhere behind us, a generator coughed and resumed its rhythm, the sound absurdly loud in a silence that felt otherwise complete, and no one spoke. Orders seemed irrelevant in the face of what we were seeing. One of the other sentries crossed himself without realizing it, the gesture small and instinctive. I tasted metal on my tongue. The fog around the lights did not move naturally. It parted around the shapes, curling at their edges as though repelled. A faint static crawled across my scalp, raising the hairs on my arms. I realized then that the sensation was not just pressure, but awareness. The uncomfortable certainty of being noticed. Morris finally broke the silence. "How long?" The sentry swallowed. "Since before the call, sir. They haven't moved." As if in response to being acknowledged, one of the shapes shifted, not forward, not backward, but subtly, adjusting its position by a fraction that sent a ripple of unease through everyone watching. There was no acceleration, no visible path. One moment it occupied a point in the sky, the next it occupied another, slightly closer to the perimeter. The movement was wrong in a way that made my stomach tighten. Physics, which had always been a comfort to me, felt suddenly negotiable that I found myself glancing back toward the radar hut, absurdly hoping the screen would contradict my eyes. It did not need to. The truth was already above us, undeniable and vast. The shapes seemed to pulse faintly now, not with light but with presence, as if they were exerting themselves simply by existing here. The pressure in the air deepened until my ears rang softly. One sentry dropped to a knee, not in panic but in surrender, as though the sky had demanded it. "Sir," someone whispered, "should we challenge them?" The question hung there, ridiculous and heartbreaking. Challenge what? With what authority? With what language? Morris did not answer. His face had gone pale beneath the floodlights, his eyes reflecting the dark above. I realized then that command had failed us not through incompetence, but through the simple fact that nothing in our training accounted for being observed by something that did not need to hide. A faint vibration passed through the ground. So subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been standing still. Felt less like movement and more like attention sharpening. One of the shapes lowered itself slightly, descending without sound until it hovered just above the cloud layer. The halo around it intensified, bending the fog into slow, deliberate spirals. I had the overwhelming impression of depth, of vast internal space concealed behind that dark surface, like staring into deep water at night. The fear that took hold of me then was not the explosive terror of attack, but something colder and more humiliating. I felt examined, measured, catalogued, as though everything I was, my thoughts, my memories, my insignificance, were laid bare beneath that silent gaze. I wanted to look away but could not. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my spine locked in place. Around me, the others stood frozen, silhouettes beneath something ancient and patient, and no weapons were fired. No alarms sounded. The base seemed to hold its breath along with us. Time stretched thin, each second elongated until it threatened to snap. I do not know how long we stood there. Minutes, hours, an eternity compressed into a moment that still lives behind my eyes. Eventually, with the same wrongness that had marked its earlier movement, the lowered shape rose again, returning to its original position as if satisfied. One by one, the others followed suit, their outlines softening as the fog reclaimed the sky. Without warning, the pressure lifted. The air felt suddenly empty, like a room after a crowd departs. My knees buckled, and I caught myself against the fence, my hands shaking violently. Around me, men exhaled in ragged gasps, the spell broken but the memory burned in. The shapes faded not by retreating, but by ceasing to impose themselves, until the stars filled the sky once more and nothing remained but ordinary night. Command arrived late, too late to matter. Officers asked questions with practiced calm, taking statements they already knew how to bury. We were told we had seen weather phenomena, light refraction, psychological suggestion reinforced by expectation. No one argued. Arguing would have required pretending that what we saw had been ambiguous. It had not. That night, back at the radar hut, I stared at the glowing screen with new understanding. The echoes I had logged were not stray returns or malfunctions. They were markers, signatures of presence, coordinates of attention. The radar had not revealed intruders violating our airspace. It had revealed observers lingering at the edge of something they considered theirs. That was the moment we realized the radar wasn't tracking intruders. We were being surveyed. Some truths survive not because they are written down, but because certain men are never able to forget them. The base did not sleep after that night, though the routines resumed as if discipline alone could overwrite memory. Shifts rotated. Logs were filled. Radios crackled with mundane traffic that felt almost insulting in its normality. Yet something had changed in the way men moved through the corridors, in the way voices dropped instinctively near doors, in the way eyes lifted toward the ceiling whenever the wind shifted outside. We had all seen it, and we had all been told, with identical phrasing, that we had not. I found myself drawn to the older personnel in the days that followed. Men who had been here longer than the rest of us. Men who had survived the war and stayed on not out of ambition but because the service had quietly suggested they were needed. Among them was Thomas Bell, a civilian engineer contracted to maintain parts of the radar system too old and too temperamental for standard crews. He was in his late 50s, hair thinning, hands permanently stained with grease and graphite. He spoke rarely during official hours, but I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the scope, not with curiosity, but with resignation. One evening, during a lull between checks, I found him alone in the auxiliary maintenance room, smoking despite the posted warnings. The smell of tobacco mixed with hot circuitry and dust, grounding in a way nothing else at the station was anymore. I told him, without quite meaning to, that I couldn't reconcile what we had seen with anything I'd been trained to understand. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, as though confirming a sequence he already knew. "You won't," he said at last. "That's the mistake you're making." I asked him what he meant. He crushed his cigarette under his boot and looked at me with an expression that carried neither fear nor skepticism, but weary familiarity. He told me he'd been assigned to coastal installations during the war, long before radar became precise, long before electronics replaced eyes and ears. Back then, men stood watch with binoculars and searchlights, trusting instinct as much as instruments. And even then, there had been things no one wanted to put in reports. "We used to call them watchers," he said quietly. "Didn't matter where you were posted. If it was isolated, if it was important, if it sat near old ground people avoided, someone eventually mentioned seeing lights, shapes, silence where there shouldn't be silence." I told him pilots had reported similar things during the war, escorts that vanished when acknowledged. He nodded. "And before that, sailors. And before that, shepherds. Different words, same stories." He explained that the coastline near our base had been considered unlucky long before fences and warning signs. Villages abandoned after unexplained fires. Ships wrecked on clear nights. Stories passed down about the sky lowering itself close enough to listen. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition layered onto coincidence, but the problem was that his descriptions aligned too well with what we had seen. Stationary lights, absence of sound, the feeling of being observed. "They show up when men start drawing lines," Bell continued. "Borders, restricted zones. When we decide something is worth hiding." The idea unsettled me more than any talk of extraterrestrials ever could. That what we were dealing with was not new, not invaders arriving from elsewhere, but something that had always been here, adapting its methods as we adapted ours. I asked him why no one ever spoke openly about it. He gave a humorless smile. "Because the moment you do, you're not talking about defense anymore. You're talking about vulnerability." That night, I began to notice how often the older men avoided looking directly at the sky. Not out of fear, but habit. As if experience had taught them that attention worked both ways. One retired warrant officer, brought back briefly to consult on equipment upgrades, mentioned in passing that his father had served as a lookout during the First World War and had spoken of black crowns hovering above munitions depots during foggy nights. The remark was delivered casually, as though discussing weather, then never referenced again. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every generation had its language, its explanations, its official denials. But beneath that, the core experience remained consistent. Silent presence, strategic interest, withdrawal once acknowledged. It was folklore shaped by war, refined by secrecy, and preserved by men who understood that survival sometimes meant silence. At the same time, command tightened its grip. New protocols were introduced without explanation. Certain radar ranges were no longer to be discussed. Certain hours were to be logged separately, their entries stored in sealed files. We were instructed to report unusual ground sensations, vibrations, pressure changes, static buildup, even if no visual confirmation accompanied them. It was an admission disguised as procedure. They knew more than they said. They always had. Sleep became difficult. When I did manage it, my dreams were filled with vast shapes suspended just out of sight, waiting patiently while we scurried below, convinced of our importance. I woke often with the sensation that something had leaned close, examined me, and moved on. Others fared worse. One sentry requested reassignment after claiming he could feel the lights even when they were gone. Another man drank himself into silence, his eyes permanently distant when sober. The radar echoes returned sporadically, always brief, always ambiguous enough to dismiss. But now I recognized their rhythm. They were not searching. They were checking, confirming that we were still here, still watching, still worth attention. Each appearance felt less like a test and more like maintenance, as though the sky itself had obligations it fulfilled with mechanical patience. That I confronted Morris once, asking outright whether Command believed the folklore. He did not answer directly. Instead, he asked me how long I planned to remain in service. When I said I didn't know, he placed a hand on the radar console, his touch reverent in a way that unsettled me. "Long enough," he said. "You stop asking what they are. You start asking why they care." That question followed me everywhere. Why this place? Why now? The war was over, yet the station operated with urgency reserved for imminent threats. It was as if conflict itself acted as a signal flare, drawing attention from something that did not participate directly, but observed the patterns we repeated with such devotion. The older men understood this instinctively. They spoke of cycles, of long waits punctuated by brief, intense periods of observation. Empires rose, wars ignited, borders shifted, and through it all, the watchers remained, indifferent to outcomes but attentive to process. We were not targets. We were subjects. By the end of that week, I no longer felt alone on shift, even when the hut was empty. The radar sweep no longer comforted me. It felt like a shared gaze, extending my awareness upward in ways I did not entirely control. Each rotation felt like an invitation as much as a scan. I understood then why Bell and the others carried their knowledge like a burden rather than a revelation. Knowing changed how you stood beneath the sky. It altered the simple act of looking up. The night air grew heavier as another shift began, the fog rolling in with familiar insistence. As I took my position before the screen, a thought settled into me with chilling clarity. The watchers did not need to appear every night. They only needed to remind us that they could. And somewhere beyond the perimeter, beyond the fences and warning signs, something vast and patient waited for the moment we drew its attention once more. There are moments when the world does not end, but pauses long enough for you to understand how easily it could. The escalation did not announce itself with alarms or orders. It arrived quietly, slipping into the night the way fog always did at the station. Slow, inevitable, and impossible to argue with. I was back on radar duty when it began, the familiar green sweep rotating with mechanical patience. The room lit just enough to remind me I was still human. Outside, the wind had dropped completely. The sea, usually restless even in calm weather, had gone unnaturally flat. The absence of sound was so complete it felt deliberate, like a held breath. The first indication came not as a single echo, but as distortion across multiple ranges. The sweep wavered, not erratically, but uniformly, as though the air itself had thickened. Returns smeared slightly, their edges softened. I checked power levels. Normal. Calibration. Nominal. I reached for the logbook, already knowing that whatever I wrote would be inadequate. As the sweep completed another rotation, the contacts appeared, not blinking in this time, not tentative. They emerged fully formed, multiple returns locking into place across restricted airspace in a pattern too precise to be coincidence. 6 of them, perhaps more. They were spaced evenly, forming a loose arc that mirrored the coastline. No approach vectors, no altitude variance, no transponder signals, just presence, asserted with absolute confidence. The pressure returned instantly, heavier than before, pressed down on the hut, on my chest, on my thoughts. My ears rang softly, not painfully, but persistently, like standing too close to unseen machinery. The clock on the wall stuttered, its second hand hesitating between ticks. I stared at it, convinced I was imagining things, until the sweep completed again and I realized time itself seemed reluctant to move the way it was supposed to. I alerted Morris without touching the radio. He appeared within moments, his face grim, eyes scanning the scope with a recognition that chilled me more than surprise would have. He said nothing, only motioned for me to continue logging. My handwriting shook despite my efforts to steady it. Each entry felt like a confession. The radio crackled once, then erupted into overlapping static from multiple channels. Voices bled into one another, fragmented and distorted, syllables stretched and compressed beyond recognition. I tried to isolate our frequency, but the controls responded sluggishly, as though submerged. Then, abruptly, the static ceased. Not faded, stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Command called for a full perimeter report. Before the words finished transmitting, the floodlights outside dimmed, not entirely extinguished but weakened, their glow thinning into pale ghosts of themselves. The generators continued to run, but their sound seemed distant, muffled, as though wrapped in layers of cloth. The air inside the hut grew warm and stale, carrying the sharp tang of ozone. I tasted it at the back of my throat and knew, with irrational certainty, that something was happening not just above us, but around us. The sentries reported visuals almost simultaneously. Lights, or rather shapes, directly overhead. Lower than before. Closer. One voice broke mid-sentence, replaced by a sharp intake of breath and then silence. Morris ordered a physical check of the perimeter, but neither of us moved. We both understood that leaving the hut would not change what waited outside. Eventually, duty won out over dread, and we stepped into the night. The sky above the base was no longer a sky in any meaningful sense. The shapes hovered directly overhead now, blotting out entire constellations. They were larger than I had realized, their true scale revealed only by proximity. Each one was vast, smooth, and utterly devoid of visible structure. No seams, no lights, no markings. They absorbed starlight completely, creating voids against the night. The faint halos that edged them bent the fog into slow, circular currents, as if the atmosphere itself were being gently stirred. The pressure intensified to the point of pain. My vision tunneled, darkening at the edges. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, to crouch, to run, but my body refused. It was not paralysis so much as obedience. The sense of being observed sharpened into something intimate and invasive. I felt examined not just physically, but conceptually, as though the totality of me were being assessed against criteria I could not comprehend. One of the shapes began to descend. The movement was smooth and unhurried, lacking any sign of propulsion. It simply lowered itself, passing through layers of fog that parted without resistance. As it descended, the air vibrated faintly, a low-frequency resonance that I felt in my bones more than my ears. A sentry cried out and dropped to the ground, hands clamped over his ears. Another retched violently, his body reacting to stimuli his mind could not process. The descending shape stopped just above the highest mast, hovering so close I could see subtle variations along its surface, like ripples beneath deep water. For a moment, absurdly, I wondered if it was aware of the comparison. If it understood how small we were beneath it. My watch stopped. I noticed it only because the second hand froze mid-motion, the faint ticking ceasing entirely. Around me, others glanced down at their wrists with dawning horror. Radios fell silent, not dead but inert, their dials glowing uselessly. The base existed in a pocket of arrested time, sealed off from the rest of the world by something that did not need to explain itself. I do not know how long the inspection lasted. The concept of duration felt meaningless under that weight of attention. At some point, I became aware of thoughts that were not entirely my own, images flickering at the edge of perception, patterns, structures, a sense of repetition stretching far back beyond recorded history. The Watchers were not new. They were custodians of process, archivists of conflict. They observed not out of malice or curiosity, but obligation. The realization did not comfort me. It horrified me more deeply than any notion of invasion. We were not facing an enemy. We were facing an audit. The shape above the mast shifted slightly, its surface rippling once, and the pressure spiked so sharply I cried out despite myself. The sound felt foreign, intrusive in a silence that had come to feel sacred. Instantly, the vibration eased, as though my reaction had been noted and dismissed. I understood then that resistance was irrelevant. Compliance was assumed. With no warning, the shapes began to withdraw. Not retreating, not accelerating away, but lifting themselves back into the higher sky with the same smooth inevitability that had brought them down. As they rose, the pressure eased incrementally, returning sensation to limbs that had felt numb and distant. The fog collapsed back into natural movement, spilling chaotically where it had once flowed with intention. The stars reappeared one by one, tentative and fragile. The generators roared back to full presence, their noise suddenly overwhelming. Radios crackled as channels reasserted themselves in a flood of confused voices. The floodlights flared, then stabilized. Time lurched forward. My watch resumed ticking, the second hand completing the motion it had abandoned. Around me, men sagged with exhaustion, some dropping to their knees, others laughing hysterically, relief and terror tangling into something incoherent. Command arrived within minutes, their urgency bordering on panic. Orders were barked, reports demanded, explanations insisted upon. But the words felt hollow. No language we possessed could adequately frame what had occurred. Intelligence officers appeared before dawn, pale and tight-lipped, confiscating equipment, sealing logs, issuing threats that sounded routine compared to the reality we had endured. That we were told, officially, that an electrical anomaly had caused mass hallucination. That stress and environmental factors had produced a shared psychological episode. That no craft had been present. That the station had never been in danger. I signed the statement with a hand that still trembled, aware that the truth did not require my agreement to persist. That night marked the end of denial. Whatever had hovered above us was no longer content to remain at the edge of detection. It had closed the distance deliberately, confidently, and withdrawn only after completing its purpose. The station felt smaller afterward, diminished by comparison. We had not been spared. We had been spared further attention. For now, as I returned to the radar hut the following evening, exhaustion clinging to me like a second skin, the sweep resumed its steady rotation. The sky appeared empty, normal, harmless. I knew better. Somewhere beyond the reach of our instruments, beyond the comfort of our explanations, the watchers waited, satisfied for the moment, their interest catalogued and filed away. That was the night the sky held still, and in doing so, taught us how little it needed to move to remind us of our place beneath it. The most unsettling thing about authority is how quickly it returns once the impossible steps aside, pretending it was never there at all. The morning after the sky released us, the base filled with men who had not been present the night before. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, wearing uniforms without insignia, their faces carefully neutral in a way that spoke of long practice. They moved through the station with quiet ownership, as if they had always belonged there and we had merely been caretakers in their absence. No one announced them. No one needed to. The tone of the place shifted instantly from stunned disbelief to controlled containment. That I was summoned to a debriefing room shortly after dawn. The room had been prepared hastily. Bare table, bare walls, a single bulb humming overhead. 2 officers sat across from me, neither of whom gave their names. One spoke, the other watched. Their questions followed a precise sequence, starting with my posting history, my training, my family background. Only then did they circle toward the night itself, asking not what I believed I saw, but what I had recorded. Words mattered now. Interpretations were dangerous. Facts, or something resembling them, were safer. I described radar anomalies, electrical interference, physiological responses among personnel. I avoided metaphors. I avoided conclusions. Each answer was weighed, measured against something unseen, and either accepted or gently corrected. When I hesitated, the watching officer leaned forward just enough to remind me that hesitation itself could be interpreted. By the end of the session, my account no longer felt like mine. It had been reshaped into something flatter, safer, more survivable. They informed me that the station would continue operations under revised protocols. Certain airspace classifications were being adjusted. Certain data streams would be restricted to higher clearance. All personnel were to refrain from discussing the incident, even among themselves. Violations would be treated as breaches of national security. The phrasing was calm, almost kind. The implication was not. As I left the room, I saw others waiting their turn. Some stared at the floor. Some stared straight ahead, jaws clenched. One man I recognized from perimeter watched the previous night trembled uncontrollably. His hands balled into fists as though holding himself together by force alone. He caught my eye briefly, and in that glance I saw the same understanding reflected back at me. The fear was no longer just of what we had seen, but of what we were being asked to forget. The revised orders filtered down quickly. Radar logs were to be duplicated manually and stored separately. Live feeds were to be monitored but not recorded during specific windows of time that were never explained. Any recurrence of anomalies was to be reported up the chain immediately, but never discussed laterally. The station became compartmentalized, each man isolated within his own slice of responsibility, suspicion replacing camaraderie. Silence was no longer just habit, it was policy. The psychological toll became evident within days. One operator froze mid-shift, staring at the scope as if waiting for something to reappear. He had to be escorted out, his protests incoherent, his eyes wild. Another man began insisting that the radar sweep was following him, that it lingered longer when he leaned closer, that it responded to his thoughts. He was removed quietly, his bunk stripped, his name never mentioned again. Officially, he had been reassigned. Unofficially, we all knew better. I requested leave. It was denied without explanation. Morris pulled me aside afterward, his voice low. He told me that leave was being discouraged for all personnel until further notice. Too many variables, he said. Too many risks of contamination. I asked him what that meant. He did not answer directly. Instead, he reminded me of my oath, of the importance of cohesion, of the necessity of trust in times of uncertainty. His eyes betrayed exhaustion rather than conviction. The older men retreated further into themselves. Bell avoided the radar hut entirely, focusing on maintenance tasks that kept him underground or isolated. When I tried to speak with him, he shook his head once, a small, decisive gesture. "They're listening now," he murmured, not specifying who they were. I didn't need him to. Even command seemed unsettled. Orders contradicted themselves. One day we were told to increase vigilance, the next to downplay anomalies. Reports were sent upward and returned with sections excised, conclusions altered. It was clear that whatever hierarchy existed above us was struggling to impose structure on something fundamentally resistant to it. Fear flowed downward. Responsibility flowed upward. No one in between felt secure. One evening, during a rare lull, I overheard a conversation between two intelligence officers near the communications room. They spoke in careful tones, but fragments carried. Not isolated. Other stations. Patterns emerging. The implications sent a chill through me. Whatever we had encountered was not confined to our stretch of coast. It was broader, systematic, perhaps even expected by those who had access to deeper archives. The knowledge did not bring clarity. It brought a heavier kind of dread. The idea that this had happened before, elsewhere, and been quietly absorbed into classified history suggested a long-standing relationship between conflict and observation. Wars flared. Technologies advanced. And something watched, adjusted, waited. We were not the first witnesses. We would not be the last. Sleep deprivation compounded everything. I found myself replaying the descent of the shape above the mast, the way the air had responded to it, the sense of internal cataloging. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt again that invasive awareness, the certainty that privacy was an illusion granted temporarily rather than a right. Dreams bled into waking thoughts. The sky no longer felt distant or benign. It felt proximate, attentive, burdened with memory. A week after the incident, a formal inspection took place. High-ranking officers toured the station, accompanied by men in civilian clothing who took notes without ever looking directly at us. We were instructed to behave normally. Normality under observation felt performative and hollow. One of the civilians paused near the radar hut, his gaze flicking briefly to the scope. For a fraction of a second, his expression shifted. Not surprise, but recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by professional neutrality. The implication lingered like a bruise. Shortly after, new equipment arrived under heavy guard. Components sealed in crates without labels. We were not told what they did, only how to integrate them. The modifications subtly altered the radar's sensitivity, extending its range in ways that felt less like improvement and more like invitation. I realized with a sickening clarity that our role was evolving. We were no longer just observers. We were becoming beacons. The fear among the enlisted men deepened. Whispers circulated about transfers denied, about careers quietly stalled. Compliance was rewarded with continuity. Resistance, even passive, resulted in disappearance from the roster. The base became a closed ecosystem, self-regulating through anxiety and obedience. Whatever moral objections existed were smothered beneath the weight of survival. One night, as I finished another shift, Morris confided in me something he should not have. He admitted that he had requested reassignment multiple times since the incident. Each request had been refused. "They need continuity," he said. "Familiar minds, people who've already seen." I asked him if he believed the Watchers would return. He did not hesitate. "They never left." That statement reframed everything. The absence of visual confirmation was not reassurance. It was restraint. The Watchers had achieved what they needed. They had tested proximity, measured response, evaluated control structures. Now they were content to observe from whatever vantage suited them best, confident that we would continue our duties with heightened diligence. Driven by fear as much as loyalty, that I began to understand the true function of the orders raining down from above. They were not designed to protect us from panic or preserve secrecy from the public. They were designed to demonstrate something: discipline, predictability, compliance under existential stress. We were not just being watched. We were being assessed as a system. The realization hollowed me out. Whatever romantic notions I had once held about service, about defense and duty, felt naive. We were participants in a process far larger than national interest, one that reduced conflict to data points and human reaction to variables. The Watchers did not need to intervene directly. War itself did their work for them. As I stood once more before the radar scope, logging returns that meant more than I was allowed to admit, I felt a strange duality settle in. Fear, yes, but also a grim clarity. If observation was inevitable, then how we behaved under it mattered. The orders from above demanded silence and obedience. The fear below demanded survival. Between the two lay the truth, unspoken and heavy, waiting for the moment it would surface again. Because it always did. In the end, authority reasserted itself not by explaining the impossible, but by insisting we behave as though it had never happened. And that, perhaps, was the greatest test of all. There is a particular kind of damage that does not bleed, does not scar, and does not heal, because it is never officially allowed to exist. The station began to empty in ways that were never announced. Names vanished from duty rosters. Bunks were stripped and reassigned within hours. Personal effects were boxed, labeled, and removed without ceremony. When I asked where certain men had gone, the answers were vague to the point of meaninglessness: medical reassignment, early retirement, transfer to inland facilities. The language was smooth, rehearsed, and identical each time. It did not matter who asked or who answered. The story was fixed. The radar logs followed the same fate. Sections disappeared. Entire nights were reduced to single-line summaries that conveyed nothing. Tapes were swapped, sealed, and flown out before dawn. Once, during a routine check, I noticed a discrepancy in the archive index. An entire week missing, as though it had never been recorded. When I raised the issue, I was advised gently, almost kindly, to concern myself only with current operations. History, I was reminded, was handled elsewhere. The effect on the men who remained was corrosive. Without shared acknowledgement, fear turned inward. Each of us carried our own private version of that night, replaying it in isolation, uncertain whether our memories aligned with anyone else's anymore. Conversations became cautious, then superficial, then almost non-existent. Even casual remarks about weather or equipment were weighed for unintended meaning. Silence hardened into habit. I began to experience symptoms I could not openly describe. Sudden headaches that felt electrical in nature. A low-level hum in my ears that came and went without pattern. Moments of disorientation during which the radar scope appeared to deepen, its green glow taking on an illusion of depth that made me recoil instinctively. I told no one. Others were already gone for less. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams brought the watchers back, not dramatically, but clinically, hovering above maps, tracing borders, marking points of interest with detached precision. I always woke with the sense that something had been learned at my expense. Some men coped by clinging obsessively to procedure. Checklists became talismans. Rules were followed to the letter, not out of discipline but out of desperation. If the world still obeyed certain structures, then perhaps it had not fully slipped its leash. Others unraveled more visibly. One operator began speaking to the radar under his breath, apologizing when anomalies appeared, thanking it when the sky remained empty. He was removed after being found in the hut hours after his shift ended, still standing at attention, eyes fixed on the screen. The worst part was the uncertainty, not knowing whether the watchers were truly absent or merely beyond our capacity to detect. Every unexplained sensation, a flicker in peripheral vision, a momentary pressure change, a patch of unnatural stillness, threatened to reopen the wound. And yet, weeks passed without overt incident. The sky remained empty. The scope showed nothing but the expected traffic. Officially, the crisis had ended. Unofficially, it had simply gone dormant. The station itself seemed altered, as though the events had left a residue that could not be scrubbed away. Corridors felt narrower, ceilings lower, the outside world unreal. When supply convoys arrived, their drivers avoided eye contact, unloading quickly before leaving as if relieved to escape. I wondered how much they knew, how much had filtered down through rumors and redacted briefings. Perhaps ignorance truly was a form of mercy. That I learned, through careful listening, that similar incidents had occurred elsewhere. Not details, never details, but hints. A radar station in the north abruptly decommissioned. A naval installation reassigned after unexplained equipment failures. Personnel quietly pensioned off or transferred overseas. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not an anomaly. It was an occurrence, one with a playbook refined through repetition. That knowledge brought no comfort. It only expanded the scale of dread. If this had happened before, then it would happen again. And each time, the response would be the same. Containment, erasure, quiet endurance. The watchers did not need to act openly. They could rely on our systems to suppress the impact of their presence, to convert terror into paperwork and memory into classified silence. That I began to keep a private record. Not detailed logs, that would have been too dangerous, but fragments, impressions, sensations, dates without explanation. I hid the notes carefully, knowing that discovery would end my career at best. It was not an act of rebellion so much as preservation. I needed proof that I had not imagined it, that the fear had an origin beyond my own mind. Writing became a way to anchor myself to reality, however fragile that reality felt. The nightmares intensified for several men. One former sentry, now assigned to administrative duties, confided that he no longer recognized the night sky. Stars unsettled him. Open spaces made his skin crawl. He said it felt as though something had peeled back a layer of the world and never put it back properly. He was gone 2 days later, his desk cleared before lunch. I realized then that survival at the station required a delicate balance. Remember too much and you broke. Forget too thoroughly and you lost yourself. The only viable path lay somewhere in between, carrying the knowledge quietly, allowing it to shape you without consuming you. Not everyone managed it as months passed. The station's role diminished. Equipment was left unupgraded. Staffing levels dropped. The unspoken consensus was that our usefulness had been fulfilled. We had served as witnesses, as instruments, as data points. Whether that was enough, I did not know. The watchers had not returned visibly, but their absence felt conditional, like a pause in observation rather than an end to it. One evening, Bell reappeared briefly, collecting his remaining tools before his contract ended. We shared a wordless nod. As he turned to leave, he paused and said, "They don't haunt you because they're cruel." I asked him why then. He considered for a long moment. "They haunt you because you know now, and knowing changes how you walk through the world. When my own transfer orders finally came, they were anticlimactic. A technical posting inland. No mention of the incident. No acknowledgement of service beyond standard commendations. I packed my things in silence, careful to leave nothing behind that might draw attention. As I passed through the gate for the last time, the fog rolled in from the sea, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the station until it vanished entirely from view. It struck me then that erasure worked both ways. The records would be scrubbed. The base would fade. Official history would move on untroubled. But the nightmares would travel with us, dispersed among different cities, different lives, surfacing in quiet moments when the sky felt too large or too attentive. Legends would persist, whispered among radar men and coastal communities, stripped of context but heavy with unease. The Watchers had not destroyed us. They had not needed to. They had simply left us altered, carriers of an experience that could not be shared openly, only endured. And in that endurance, the true cost of observation became clear. Some stories are not passed down because they are forbidden. They are passed down because forgetting them entirely would be a greater danger. The war taught me how to fear men, but that station taught me how to fear attention. I left the coast in late autumn, carried inland by a train that rattled like it was older than the rails beneath it. The further we traveled, the more ordinary the world became. Villages with smoke rising from chimneys, children playing near crossings, fields bordered by hedgerows that had never known fencing wire or warning signs. To anyone watching me from the outside, I must have looked like another serviceman reassigned. Another small piece moved on a board too large to question. Inside, I felt hollowed out, as though something essential had been examined and put back incorrectly. My new posting was unremarkable. Standard radar work, clear chains of command, predictable air traffic, men who complained about boredom instead of silence. I performed my duties competently, earned quiet respect, and avoided conversations that drifted toward speculation. On paper, I recovered. In practice, I learned how to live with a second awareness layered over the first, a constant background sense that the sky was no longer empty simply because it appeared so. That awareness followed me everywhere. I noticed how military installations were positioned, always near old borders, old battlefields, old scars in the land. I noticed how conflicts flared repeatedly in the same regions, as though drawn there by something deeper than politics. I noticed how advances in surveillance were justified as protection, yet always seemed to invite more scrutiny rather than less. Radar became satellites. Scopes became networks. Observation became constant. We congratulated ourselves on progress, never asking who else might be benefiting from our need to watch and be watched. At night, I still dreamt of the shapes, not as they were that final night above the mast, but as distant presences hovering beyond perception, patient and unhurried. In those dreams, there was no hostility, no threat, only an overwhelming sense of record-keeping, of long-term interest. I began to understand that fear had never been their primary tool. Familiarity was. Once you accepted the possibility of being observed, your behavior changed permanently. You regulated yourself. You anticipated judgment. You complied before coercion was necessary. It was an elegant system. When news reached me years later that the coastal station had been formally decommissioned, I felt no relief. The announcement cited budget constraints and redundancy. The land, it said, would remain restricted indefinitely due to unexploded ordnance. I recognized the phrasing. Restricted zones had a way of persisting long after their stated purpose expired. They became places where explanations ran thin and memory grew thick. Places where something once happened that no one wanted repeated or examined too closely. I never returned there. I did not need to. The station existed now as an internal geography, mapped across my thoughts. Sometimes, while walking at night, I would stop abruptly, struck by the same pressure behind the eyes, the same subtle shift in air that preceded awareness. Each time, nothing followed. No lights, no shapes, just the echo of anticipation. I learned to keep walking. Attention, I suspected, worked both ways. The older I grew, the more I reflected on what that encounter meant beyond fear. It was tempting to frame it as an invasion narrowly avoided, or a mystery unresolved. But neither explanation satisfied me. The Watchers had not behaved like conquerors or explorers. They had not harvested resources or issued demands. They had observed infrastructure, response, hierarchy. They had tested proximity and reaction, then withdrawn once sufficient data had been gathered. Their interest lay not in us as individuals, but in us as a system at war with itself. That realization reframed history in uncomfortable ways. How many legends of angels, demons, sky gods, or omens had originated from similar encounters filtered through less technical language? How many times had humanity mistaken observation for intervention, assigning moral intent where there was only detached attention? The Watchers did not guide us. They did not warn us. They simply ensured that our patterns were known, and perhaps recorded. That knowledge changed how I viewed secrecy. We told ourselves classification protected the public from panic, that silence preserved stability. But I began to suspect secrecy served another function entirely. Preserved behavior. It ensured that institutions continued operating predictably, that fear remained localized and manageable. In doing so, we made ourselves easier to observe, easier to model, easier to anticipate. In my final years of service, I declined promotions that would have placed me closer to strategic oversight. I did my job well, but without ambition. Advancement, I realized, would only draw me deeper into systems designed to project certainty while suppressing doubt. I had seen too clearly how fragile those systems were when confronted with something they could not dominate. I chose distance instead, carrying my knowledge quietly, like a private burden I would not pass on lightly. When I finally left the RAF, the sky felt larger again, but not kinder. Civilian life brought noise, distraction, and the illusion of privacy. Yet even there, I noticed how surveillance followed us into peacetime: cameras, records, data trails. We built mirrors of the Watchers' methods, telling ourselves it was necessary, that it kept us safe. Perhaps it did. Or perhaps it simply made us legible. I sometimes wonder whether the Watchers still hover above restricted zones, or whether their vantage has shifted to something less visible, less dramatic. Perhaps they no longer need to descend. Perhaps the systems we have built broadcast everything they require. The thought troubles me more than the memory of those shapes blotting out the stars. Direct observation at least allowed for awe. Indirect observation dissolves quietly into routine. Legends persist along the coast, I'm told. Fishermen still speak of nights when the sea goes flat and the air grows heavy. Radar operators still trade stories in hushed tones about returns that behave too deliberately to dismiss. Each generation finds its own language, its own excuses, its own ways of filing the experience away. The core remains unchanged. Something watches when we gather for war. Something pays attention when we divide, fortify, and prepare to destroy one another. I no longer believe the question is whether we are alone. I believe the question is whether we are interesting, and if so, why. The answer, I fear, lies not in our capacity for creation, but in our talent for repetition. We build the same structures, fight the same conflicts, draw the same lines over and over again. From a distance, that pattern must be irresistible to study. In the end, what haunts me is not the memory of fear, but the clarity that followed it. The realization that humanity may not be the protagonist of its own story, but a case study unfolding in cycles. War, legend, secrecy, progress, observed, recorded, allowed to continue. The station that wasn't on maps taught me that some truths are not hidden because they are dangerous, but because they are humbling. We like to believe we stand watch over the world. That night showed me how easily that perspective can invert. And once inverted, it never fully rights itself. Even now, when I look up at a quiet sky, I do not search for lights. I listen instead, for the silence that presses too closely, for the stillness that suggests attention. Because if there is one lesson that endures beyond service, beyond secrecy, beyond fear, it is this: war may be humanity's loudest signal, and somewhere beyond our understanding, something has learned to listen. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.